The Montana wilderness stretched vast and unforgiving around Jack Callahan's cabin, an island of solitude in the heart of nowhere. Here, the land was indifferent to time, its only rhythm dictated by the sun filtering through the towering pines and the distant murmur of the river. It was the kind of isolation that most people feared, but Jack embraced it. It had been 3 years since he left the Marines, and in those 3 years he had become a ghost. No phone, no internet, no unnecessary connections to a world that had taken everything from him. Out here, he didn't need to be Jack Callahan, the soldier. He didn't need to be the man haunted by things he had done and the men he had lost. He could just be. The evening chill had begun to set in, and Jack worked methodically, splitting logs with practiced efficiency. The rhythmic crack of his axe echoed through the quiet, each strike sending a satisfying shudder through the ground. The pile of firewood by his cabin had grown over the past few weeks, stacked neatly under a tarp, ready for the harsh winter ahead. Winter was the reason he had built this place so far from civilization. It buried the world in silence, turned the roads impassable, and kept people away. People were unpredictable, and Jack had seen too much of what they were capable of. As he reached for another log, the sound of something rustling through the underbrush made him pause. He straightened, gripping the axe a little tighter, listening. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, the distant howl of a coyote, had vanished, leaving only the whisper of wind through the trees. Then a sharp snap of twigs. Jack turned toward the tree line, his heartbeat steady but alert. It could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but animals moved with confidence, with purpose. This was something else. The sound came again, closer this time. A staggered, uneven rhythm, followed by the unmistakable hitch of a breath. Shaky, fearful. Jack set the axe down carefully and reached for the hunting rifle leaning against the porch railing. The weight of it was familiar, a natural extension of himself. His fingers settled around the grip as he moved toward the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees. And then they emerged, 2 children. Barefoot, their clothes ragged and smeared with dirt. The girl, no older than 10, clutched the boy's wrist in a grip so tight it looked painful. The boy, 6 or 7 at most, shivered violently, his breaths coming in panicked gasps. Their wide, hollow eyes locked onto Jack, pleading without words. Jack's stomach tightened. He had seen that look before, not here. Not in this quiet pocket of Montana, but in war zones, in the eyes of people caught between monsters and the men sent to stop them. He lowered the rifle. His voice was calm, steady, but edged with quiet authority. "You're safe now," he said. "Oh, what happened?" The girl's breathing was ragged, her small chest rising and falling too fast. She tried to speak, her lips forming syllables without sound, like her body was too exhausted to produce the words. Jack took a slow step closer, lowering himself to her level, making himself smaller, less threatening. "Hey," he said softly, "take a breath. Tell me what happened." The girl swallowed hard, darting a frantic glance over her shoulder toward the tree line. Then she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are coming for us." Jack felt those words settle into his bones, cold and heavy. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The fear in her voice told him everything he needed to know. The real question was, how much time do we have? Jack's eyes flicked past the children, scanning the dense forest behind them. Nothing moved, but the silence was unnatural. No birds, no insects. Even the wind felt muted. He shifted his focus back to the kids. "You're okay now," he assured them, his voice even. "No one's gonna hurt you here. But I need you to tell me. How many? How far?" The girl opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat. Jack's gut tightened. Too late, the forest erupted. A gunshot cracked through the stillness, shattering the illusion of safety. The bullet whined past Jack's head, splintering bark on a tree behind him. Instinct took over before thought could catch up. He lunged forward, grabbing the kids and pulling them down behind the stacked firewood. Another shot. Closer. The boy let out a small whimper, muffling it against his sister's chest. Jack pressed a firm hand against the girl's shoulder, willing her to stay down. Whoever they are, they're here already. Jack moved fast, keeping low as he grabbed the rifle he had dropped in the chaos. His mind worked rapidly, assessing angles, distance. The shots had come from the ridge to the east, high ground, smart positioning. They weren't amateurs. He could run, take the kids, disappear into the forest. But he didn't know how many were out there, and he didn't know if the kids could keep up. No, running wasn't an option. Not yet. He peeked around the edge of the firewood stack, catching a flicker of movement through the trees. At least 2, maybe 3, moving with purpose. A third shot rang out, ricocheting off the metal railing of his porch. Suppressive fire. They were trying to keep him pinned. Jack exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the rifle. They weren't expecting a fight. Big mistake. Keeping low, he moved, flanking to the right where the underbrush was thicker. The attackers were closing in fast, their footfalls barely audible over the wind. They thought they had him pinned. They thought wrong. Jack spotted the first one through the trees. A tall man, dressed in dark tactical gear. His rifle raised as he scanned the clearing. Jack didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. One shot. The man went down without a sound. The second was faster, ducking behind a tree and returning fire. Jack dropped to the ground, rolling behind a fallen log as bullets tore through the underbrush where he had been standing. He waited, counted the shots. When the rhythm faltered, reloading, Jack moved. He broke cover, firing 2 precise rounds. The second attacker crumpled. A beat of silence. Then movement. Jack spun, rifle raised, but it wasn't an attacker. The girl. She had crawled from cover, dragging her brother with her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked onto Jack with a silent question. Is it over? Not yet. Jack exhaled sharply, scanning the ridge. No more movement, no more gunshots. For now, they were safe. But Jack had been in enough firefights to know this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Jack Callahan had heard a lot of terrifying things in his life. He had heard the distant whistle of mortars before they slammed into the ground, the tortured screams of men pinned under wreckage, the chilling silence of a battlefield where nothing moved except the dead. But those 5 words, "They are coming for us," hit him differently. He had spent 3 years in the solitude of the Montana wilderness, burying his past beneath the rhythm of chopping wood, tracking elk, and losing himself in the deafening quiet of the mountains. But war had a way of finding men like him. And now, crouched behind his stack of firewood with 2 terrified children clinging to each other, he knew his peace had just been shattered beyond repair. Jack's mind shifted into survival mode. He needed information. Fast. "Who?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The girl was still trembling, her small hands clutching at her brother like he might disappear. "They—" She swallowed hard, blinking up at him. "They took us. They—" Her voice cracked. Jack's stomach coiled with something cold and sharp. He turned his attention to the boy, who hadn't spoken a word since appearing out of the trees. The kid was barely 6, his face streaked with dirt, his blonde hair matted. But it was his eyes that hit Jack the hardest. Glassy, hollow, as if he had already seen too much of the world. Jack recognized that look. He had seen it in refugee camps overseas, in the faces of civilians who had been used and discarded like cattle. Whatever these kids had escaped from, it was bad. "Where did you come from?" Jack tried again, keeping his voice low. The girl, still trying to catch her breath, pointed shakily toward the trees. "We ran," she whispered, "all night. I don't know how far, I just—" Her eyes darted back toward the darkened woods. "They'll come. They always do." Jack exhaled slowly. The terror in her voice was real, and he believed her. But first, he needed to get them inside. "Come on," he said, rising smoothly, rifle still gripped in his right hand. "Let's move." The girl hesitated. The boy didn't move at all. Jack softened his voice, tapping into the part of himself he had buried, the part that knew how to talk to the scared, the lost, the ones who had nothing left to cling to. "I won't let them hurt you," he said, holding her gaze, "but I need you both to trust me." Something flickered in the girl's eyes. Just a sliver of hope. She nodded. Jack scooped up the boy without another word. The kid barely reacted, as if his body had given up the need to fight. That wasn't a good sign. Jack led them toward the cabin, his boots silent against the dirt path. Every step he took, he listened, really listened. The forest had come alive again, but not in a way that gave him comfort. He could hear movement, distant, calculated. They weren't alone. The cabin was a fortress of necessity. Jack had built it himself, with no one else in mind. No neighbors, no visitors, just him and the wilderness. The walls were reinforced with thick logs, the windows small and defensible. He had dug a root cellar beneath the floorboards, stocked with enough supplies to last a long, cold winter. The world could burn, and he wouldn't notice. Until now. Jack ushered the kids inside, securing the door behind them. He moved through the space efficiently, checking the locks, ensuring the blackout curtains were drawn tight. His generator was silent. He rarely used it unless absolutely necessary. The girl stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The boy had slumped onto the couch, curling into a ball. Jack pulled a blanket from the footlocker near his bed and draped it over the boy's small frame. The kid flinched at first, then slowly relaxed into it. "What's your name?" Jack asked the girl. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say. "Maddie," she finally whispered. "This is my brother, Ben." "Maddie," Jack repeated, filing it away. "Where did you run from?" She shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted, voice small. "It was just a camp, a place with fences." Jack's stomach tightened. Fences, not a home, not a town, a camp. And suddenly, Jack knew exactly what kind of hell these kids had escaped from. He crouched in front of her, keeping his expression neutral. "Maddie, listen to me. I need to know how many people we're dealing with. Do you know how many were there?" She bit her lip. "A lot." Jack nodded. "Guards?" She swallowed hard. "Yes." "Guns?" A small nod. Jack took a slow breath. Child trafficking. It wasn't new. He had seen it in the Middle East, in parts of Europe, even back in the States. It was a sickness that festered in the dark corners of society, hidden in the places no one wanted to look. And now, somehow, it had spilled into his backyard. Jack rose to his full height. He had spent the last 3 years pretending the world couldn't touch him. Now, it had landed on his doorstep, and he sure as hell wasn't about to ignore it. The first attack came just before midnight. Jack had been preparing for it since the second they stepped inside. He had turned off every light, reinforcing the doors and windows, using every trick he knew to make the cabin disappear into the darkness. But the people hunting these kids weren't stupid. They would be searching for signs of movement, heat signatures, anything that pointed to life. Jack knew their game. And he was better at it. He sat near the window, rifle resting across his lap, watching, listening. Then, a flicker of movement. The tree line far enough out that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Jack wasn't most people. A shape moved through the shadows. Then another. Jack inhaled deeply. 2, no 3, armed. They weren't kicking down his door. Not yet. They were watching, waiting. Jack tapped his fingers against the stock of his rifle, thinking. They didn't know he had seen them. That was their mistake. He moved silently to Maddie and Ben, crouching beside them. The girl was still awake, eyes wide and alert. The boy was asleep, exhaustion finally pulling him under. Jack kept his voice low. "They're out there." Maddie stiffened. "I need you to do exactly what I say, okay?" he continued. She nodded once. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. "Good. Now listen." Outside, a sharp crack echoed through the night. Not a gunshot, a warning. Jack's jaw clenched. They were trying to spook him, trying to make him show himself. A slow grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He stood, moving toward the door. He checked his rifle, then reached for the combat knife strapped to his belt. His war had ended 3 years ago. Tonight, it started again. The forest held its breath. Jack Callahan crouched low near the cabin's door, rifle in one hand, knife sheathed at his side. The night was alive in ways most people never noticed. The distant rustling of wind through pine branches, the chirping of unseen insects. But there was something else beneath it, a silence that didn't belong. He knew what that meant. Predators were near. Outside, the darkness was thick, the moon barely slicing through the canopy. Jack had counted at least 3 figures moving in the tree line. He didn't know if there were more, but the way they moved, the way they stopped and started, told him everything he needed to know. They weren't searching, they were hunting, and he was their target. Inside, Maddie sat frozen on the couch, her little brother curled up beside her. She was gripping his arm so tightly Jack worried she might cut off his circulation. Jack moved fast, crouching in front of her. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "They don't know for sure if we're in here yet. That gives us an advantage." Maddie swallowed hard. "They always find us," she whispered. Jack exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. "Not this time," he said. She blinked at him, startled by the certainty in his voice. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Maddie hesitated, then nodded. Jack looked at Ben, who still hadn't spoken a word. The kid's eyes flickered toward him, then to the floor. No nod, no reaction. But Jack had seen enough broken kids to recognize when one was barely holding it together. He didn't push. "Okay," Jack whispered. "We have to move, now." Maddie's breath hitched. "Move where?" Jack glanced at the cabin walls. This place was solid, built to withstand storms and wildlife, but it was also a trap. If their pursuers got bold enough to set fire to the structure, or worse, pin them inside, he'd be forced to fight on their terms. He'd never fought on the enemy's terms. "There's a path behind the cabin," Jack explained. "It's not easy, but it leads up the ridge." He glanced between them. "We go now. We get ahead of them." Maddie was already shaking her head. "No, they'll see us." Jack gave her a steady look. "Not if we do this right." Another sound outside, closer this time. Jack turned toward the window. Movement in the trees, a shadow shifting against the bark. Time was up. Jack moved fast, grabbing the thick wool blanket from the couch. "Maddie, take this. Wrap it around Ben. His feet are exposed, and it's cold." Maddie didn't argue. She pulled the blanket around her brother, her fingers trembling as she tucked him in. Jack reached under the couch, retrieving a small go-bag he had kept packed for emergencies. Inside, a flashlight, extra ammo, a field knife, protein bars. He slung the bag over his shoulder. Then he grabbed the shotgun. He didn't need it for them. He needed it for the distraction. "Maddie," he said, kneeling down again, "I need you to trust me one more time." She swallowed but nodded. Jack handed her a small, cold object, a compass. "I'm going to lead you out the back," he whispered. "You're going to keep moving west until you hit the ridge. Then follow the compass north." Maddie's lips parted, fear creeping back in. "You're not coming? I'll be right behind you." Jack gave her a firm look. "But I need to slow them down first." "No!" Maddie gasped, her voice too loud. "No, they'll—" Jack clamped a hand over her mouth gently, silencing her. "I know what I'm doing," he whispered. She was trembling beneath his grip. Jack softened his tone. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised. "But you have to move now." Her wide, panicked eyes searched his, and for a moment Jack thought she would refuse, that she would freeze like so many people did under pressure. Then, slowly, she nodded. Jack released her. "Good," he whispered. "Now go." Jack led them to the back door, every step precise, controlled. He cracked it open an inch, scanning the darkness. The trees loomed tall, thick with shadows. If they stayed low, stayed quiet, they had a chance. He motioned with 2 fingers. "Move." Maddie took Ben's hand, guiding him into the dark. Jack stayed at the threshold, rifle tight in his grip, watching them disappear into the trees. Only when he was sure they were gone did he move. He stepped back inside, grabbed the shotgun, and took a slow breath. Then he went hunting. The first man was close, too close. Jack saw the faint outline of a figure shifting through the brush, the dim glow of a scope catching the moonlight. They were professionals, not just some backwoods thugs. These men knew how to track, how to move. But Jack was better. He pressed himself against the log wall of the cabin, inhaling slow and deep. Timing was everything. The man moved forward, his steps cautious. He was alone, probably scouting ahead. His rifle was up, scanning. Jack waited. Waited. Now. In one fluid motion, Jack exploded from his position, closing the distance in an instant. The man had no chance to react. Jack grabbed him from behind, one arm locking around his throat, the other forcing his rifle down. The man struggled, a sharp, desperate gasp. Jack tightened his grip. Shh! A violent shudder. Then nothing. Jack lowered the body silently to the ground. He pulled the man's radio, clicked it off, then retrieved a small hunting knife from the man's belt. One down, the others weren't far. Jack slipped into the trees, moving fast. He needed to draw them away, give the kids more time. He reached the edge of the clearing, leveled the shotgun, and fired into the air. The explosion shattered the night. Instantly, shouts rang out. There! More movement, more shadows shifting. Jack sprinted through the trees, drawing them away from the ridge. They followed, just as he wanted. The chase was brutal. Jack knew this land better than they did, but they had numbers. They were closing in, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. His breath was steady, just a little farther. Up ahead, he spotted what he was looking for, a narrow ravine hidden beneath dense foliage. Jack pushed himself harder, then at the last moment he dove. The ground vanished beneath him. He hit the slope hard, sliding down the embankment just as gunfire ripped through the space he had been standing in. His body slammed into the dirt at the bottom, pain flaring up his ribs, but he was alive, and they had no idea where he had gone. Above, the men cursed, their flashlights scanning the darkness. Jack grinned, teeth flashing in the moonlight. He was just getting started. The night was far from over. Maddie and Ben were still out there, and the men hunting them wouldn't stop. But neither would Jack. He had spent years running from war. Tonight, it had found him again, and God help the bastards who thought they could take what was his. Jack Callahan had spent years in war zones, learning the difference between being the hunted and the hunter. There was an instinct to it, a primal understanding of space, movement, and intent. Most men, even trained killers, lacked the patience to wait, to let the moment unfold before striking. Jack wasn't most men. Lying at the bottom of the ravine, he stayed motionless, his breath slow and steady. Above him, the men tracking him cursed into the dark, scanning the trees with their rifles raised. "He was right here," one of them snarled, his voice sharp with frustration. Another voice, calmer, more experienced. "Then he's still close." Jack's lip curled slightly. "You have no idea. The moonlight barely touched the forest floor here." And Jack used it to his advantage. He inched forward on his belly, shifting silently through the thick underbrush. The pain in his ribs from the fall throbbed, but pain was just information. He ignored it. Above, a flashlight beam cut through the night, sweeping across the ravine. Jack stayed still, watched, waited. He counted at least 3 men, maybe 4. They were professionals, but they were making a mistake. They were reacting. They were looking for him in a panic, moving too quickly, too loudly. Jack had already won. They just didn't know it yet. Maddie and Ben were somewhere in the woods, moving toward the ridge. They had a head start, but Jack needed to buy them more time, which meant he had to make this messy. Silently, he reached for his belt, fingers closing around a small, palm-sized rock. He lifted it, measured the distance, then threw. The rock sailed through the darkness, hitting the trunk of a pine tree with a sharp crack. Instantly the men spun toward the sound. There, gunfire erupted, rapid and uncontrolled. Rounds tore into the trees, splintering bark, cutting through the night with brutal efficiency. Jack was already moving. As they fired blindly at nothing, he climbed the ravine wall in absolute silence, using the thick roots for leverage. His muscles burned, but his movements were controlled, deliberate. By the time they realized they were shooting at shadows, he was behind them. The first man never saw him coming. Jack moved fast, a silent shadow in the dark. He struck from behind, his arm locking around the man's throat, cutting off both sound and air. The struggle lasted seconds, then the body went limp. Jack lowered him to the ground, taking his sidearm and radio before vanishing back into the trees. The second man turned at the last second, sensing something was wrong. But he was too slow. Jack grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward with brutal strength. The man barely had time to gasp before Jack drove his knee into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He twisted, using the momentum to slam the man's head into a tree trunk. A sickening crack. The body slumped. Two down. The others had heard the noise. Jack slipped back into the darkness, gripping the stolen radio. He clicked it on, listening. A voice crackled through the static. "Report." "What the hell is happening?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, he let them feel the silence. Fear was a powerful weapon. And right now, they were drowning in it. Jack didn't know how many more were out there, but he did know one thing. This wasn't just a hunt. This was a retrieval mission. They didn't want to kill the kids. They wanted to take them. That meant they weren't just dealing with some backwoods mercs looking for a payday. This was an operation. Jack had dealt with men like this before. Organized, well-funded, ruthless, which meant they had resources. Which meant Maddie and Ben weren't safe yet. Jack clenched his jaw. He needed to get back to them. Now. The night was still thick with tension as Jack moved. He stayed low, using the trees for cover, his rifle tight against his shoulder. Somewhere in the distance, he heard movement. The others were still searching for him, but they were scattered now, their formation broken. Good. He cut through the woods, retracing the path the kids had taken. His boots barely made a sound against the forest floor. Then, a flicker of movement. Jack froze, a figure ahead moving through the trees, smaller, lighter, not a threat. Maddie. Jack exhaled sharply, relief tempered by urgency. She had made it. She was crouched behind a fallen tree, her brother pressed against her side. She was gripping the compass he had given her, but her eyes were locked onto the darkness, scanning for danger. Jack felt something like pride stir in his chest. Good girl. She had listened. He moved toward them, slow and deliberate, making sure she saw him before he got too close. Her eyes widened. "Jack?" she whispered. "It's me," he confirmed. "You okay?" She nodded, but her face was still tight with fear. "Ben's tired, he won't talk." Jack crouched beside them, studying the boy. Ben's small body was curled up, his breathing fast and shallow. Shock. He had seen it before. Jack softened his voice. "Hey, buddy." No response. Jack reached into his go bag, pulling out a protein bar. He unwrapped it carefully, breaking off a piece. "Try this," he said, offering it. Ben didn't move. Jack glanced at Maddie. "Has he eaten?" She shook her head. Jack exhaled. "Okay," he murmured, placing the food in Maddie's hand instead. "You eat. He'll follow." Maddie hesitated, then took a small bite. Ben stirred, his eyes flickering toward her. Jack waited. Then, slowly, Ben reached out, taking the next piece of food. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jack looked back toward the woods. The night wasn't over. They weren't safe yet, but at least, for now, they were still alive. "We need to keep moving," Jack said finally. "There are more of them out there." Maddie swallowed the last bite of food and nodded. Jack helped Ben to his feet, steadying the boy as he swayed. "Stay close," Jack murmured. They started moving again, cutting through the thickest part of the forest. Jack led the way, his rifle sweeping the darkness. They still had miles to go before sunrise, and he wasn't sure who else was out there waiting for them. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jack Callahan knew the men hunting them weren't amateurs. The way they moved, coordinated, precise, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a group of desperate criminals or rogue mercs. These were trained operators, men who had done this before, men like him, and men like that didn't just let their targets disappear. Jack led Maddie and Ben deeper into the forest, cutting west toward the high ground. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. The terrain was rugged, uneven. His boots crunched softly over frost-covered leaves, but he kept their movement controlled, slow. Speed wasn't the priority. Stealth was. Maddie clutched her little brother's hand, her breath coming in short. sharp puffs. She was trying to keep up, but he could hear the exhaustion in her steps. They needed to stop, but not yet. Jack glanced back the way they came. The darkness stretched endlessly behind them, but he could feel the pursuit closing in. Then, a flicker of movement, too far to be certain, a shadow shifting between the trees. His grip tightened on his rifle. They were still being tracked. Jack inhaled slowly, recalculating. They needed to disappear fast. He turned to Maddie. "We're going to cover our tracks," he whispered. "Do exactly as I say." She nodded, though her body was trembling. Jack reached down and scooped a handful of cold, wet dirt. He smeared it on his arms, then on his face. "Rub this on your skin. Clothes, too." Maddie hesitated, but did as she was told, rubbing the mud onto her arms, then helping Ben do the same. Jack kept his voice low. "It'll help mask our scent. If they're using dogs, we need every advantage we can get." Maddie's breath hitched. "Dogs?" Jack met her gaze. "Maybe, maybe not, but we're not taking chances." She swallowed hard, then nodded. Jack turned his attention back to the woods. They had a small lead, but it wouldn't last. He had to slow them down. The first step was eliminating their scent trail completely. Jack led them into a shallow creek, the icy water biting through their shoes and socks. Maddie gasped at the cold, but Jack didn't stop. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. They followed the stream for at least 100 yards before Jack led them onto a patch of exposed rock. He turned, scanning the darkness. Then he dropped to one knee, pressing his hand against the cold, damp earth. Tracking wasn't just about footprints, it was about patterns. Men like these relied on technology, thermal drones, GPS markers, radio signals. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. It was old, nearly useless out here in the wilderness, but that didn't matter, because it still had a signal. Jack placed it on a nearby rock, left the screen dimly lit, and moved on. It was bait, a digital breadcrumb. If they were tracking his phone, they'd think he was still moving in that direction. It wouldn't fool them forever, but it would buy him time. By the time they reached the base of a steep, rocky incline, Maddie and Ben were barely holding on. Ben had stopped crying, which worried Jack more than if he had been screaming. The kid was shutting down. Jack knew that feeling too well. Maddie's legs were shaking. She was strong, but she was running on pure adrenaline, and that would only last so long. Jack exhaled, then knelt in front of them. "We need to climb," he said. "Once we're up there, we can rest." Maddie stared at the slope, her expression crumbling. I don't know if I can." "You can," Jack said simply. "And I'll help you." She swallowed, nodding. Jack crouched, lifting Ben onto his back. The boy was light, his small frame limp against him. Jack secured the kid's arms around his neck. Then he turned to Maddie. 3 points of contact at all times. Use your hands, not just your feet. Follow my lead." She nodded again, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jack started climbing. The rocks were slick, but Jack knew how to move over terrain like this. He kept his pace steady, testing each foothold before shifting his weight. Maddie followed, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Halfway up, Jack risked a glance over his shoulder. The forest below stretched in eerie silence. The darkness seemed endless, but something wasn't right. He narrowed his eyes, then a small red light. It was faint, barely visible against the trees, but Jack knew exactly what it was. A drone. They had drones. Jack's mind raced. Drones meant infrared. Infrared meant heat signatures, and a heat signature on an exposed rock wall was like a flare in the dark. They had minutes, maybe less. Jack clenched his jaw. They had to disappear now. He turned, gripping Maddie's arm. "Don't look back," he ordered. "Just keep climbing." She obeyed. Jack shifted Ben's weight, pushing harder. The top of the ridge was close, just a few more feet. Then the night exploded with movement. A voice, sharp, cutting. "I've got them!" A gunshot. Rock splintered near Jack's hand. Maddie let out a strangled gasp. Jack moved on instinct. He shoved Maddie up the last few feet, then threw himself over the ridge, rolling onto solid ground. Another shot. Jack twisted, shielding Ben's body as dirt kicked up near his boots. He grabbed Maddie, pulling her close. "Run!" She hesitated. Jack roared, "Go!" This time she obeyed. The chase was on. Jack kept low, leading them into the thickest part of the trees. Their only advantage was that they were faster in close terrain. The men behind them had rifles, but rifles were useless if you couldn't see your target. Jack moved like a ghost, his senses sharp. Ahead, a cave, small, barely noticeable, tucked beneath a rocky overhang. Perfect. He grabbed Maddie, pushing her inside. "Stay down, don't move." She nodded, pulling Ben into the darkness. Jack turned. Then he vanished into the trees. He circled around. He needed to cut them off. Jack moved fast, pressing his body low to the ground. The men were closing in, their flashlights cutting through the trees. They were methodical, sweeping the area. Jack reached for his knife. This was going to get ugly. The first man was careless. Jack waited behind a thick tree, his breathing slow, measured. When the man passed, Jack struck, a brutal, controlled movement, a hand over the mouth, a blade between the ribs, a strangled gasp, then silence. Jack lowered the body, taking the man's weapon, a suppressed pistol. Good. One down. The others wouldn't take long to notice he was missing. Jack moved before they could regroup. He had one goal now: end this, fast, because Maddie and Ben were waiting. And Jack Callahan didn't leave people behind. Not ever. Jack Callahan had been in enough combat zones to recognize the patterns of organized predators. The men tracking them weren't just criminals or thugs. They were trained, disciplined, methodical. That meant one thing: this wasn't random. Maddie and Ben hadn't just escaped from some backwoods traffickers. They had run from something bigger. And Jack had just killed one of their men. There was no turning back now. He crouched behind the thick trunk of a pine tree, listening. The remaining men were moving cautiously now, realizing one of their own had vanished. Jack could hear the low murmur of voices over a radio. He adjusted his grip on the stolen pistol, the suppressor attached to the barrel still warm. One down, at least two more still searching. Maybe more. Jack took a slow breath. You've been here before. War had a rhythm. He had learned to move with it. He wasn't being hunted anymore. He was hunting them. The cave was 20 yards behind him. Maddie and Ben were tucked inside, hidden beneath thick underbrush. Jack had told them to stay quiet, to stay still. Maddie had nodded. Ben hadn't reacted. The kid was shutting down, his small body stiff with fear. Jack had seen that look before, too many times. A child who had lost so much they weren't sure if they even existed anymore. He pushed that thought away, one fight at a time. A branch snapped. Jack froze. 15 feet ahead, a figure moved through the trees. The man was slower now, cautious, his rifle raised. He had seen the body. He knew someone was out here. Jack adjusted his stance, lining up the shot. The pistol coughed. The man staggered, his body jerking forward before he collapsed into the dirt. Jack didn't hesitate. He moved fast and silent, closing the distance. He crouched beside the body, searching the man's pockets. A radio. Jack clicked it on, lowering the volume. A voice crackled through. "Status. Repeat. Team 2. What's your status?" Jack let the silence stretch. Then he clicked the mic. Static, no words. Then he turned the volume off completely. Let them wonder, let them panic. Jack grabbed the man's rifle, slinging it over his shoulder. 2 down, 1 more in the area, maybe more coming. Then something unexpected. A voice. Distant, high-pitched. A child. Jack's entire body went rigid. Not Maddie, not Ben. Another child. A faint, broken sob. Jack clenched his jaw, the sound sinking into his chest like a knife. That changed everything. Jack moved fast, following the sound. He kept low, his boots silent against the forest floor. His pulse was steady, his breath controlled. Then, through the trees, he saw it. A small clearing, a transport truck, a man standing guard outside, and beside him, a cage. Jack's stomach turned to stone. There were 3 kids inside, young, terrified. Jack inhaled slowly, his fingers tightened on the pistol grip. The mission had changed. This wasn't just about Maddie and Ben anymore. Jack wasn't running anymore. He was going to end this, all of it. He counted his options. The man standing guard was armed. He wasn't watching his surroundings. His focus was on the cage. Jack lined up the shot. Breathe in, breathe out. The suppressed pistol coughed once. The man crumpled. Jack was already moving. The kids inside the cage flinched as he approached. They were small. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8. Their eyes were wide, glassy. Jack crouched beside the lock, working fast. One of the kids, a girl, maybe 6, watched him with quiet, hollow eyes. "Are you real?" she whispered. Jack's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said, "I'm real." The lock clicked open. He pulled the cage door open. "Come on, we have to move." The kids hesitated. Jack heard movement behind him, shouts. They had been seen. No time. He scooped up the youngest child, gripping the oldest girl's wrist. "Move," she obeyed. The other boy followed. Jack ran. Gunfire erupted behind them. They reached the trees. Jack kept low, pushing the kids ahead. Then a burst of static from the radio, still clipped to his belt. A voice, cold, controlled. "You don't know what you're interfering with." Jack ripped the radio off and crushed it beneath his boot. He didn't care who they were. They had kids in cages. That was all he needed to know. Maddie's eyes widened when she saw them. "Who?" "Later," Jack snapped. "We have to go." They moved. Jack was running scenarios in his head, planning the next move. They needed a real hiding spot. The cave wouldn't hold if they had dogs, if they had drones. He needed an exit strategy, fast. Then the worst sound imaginable, a low mechanical whine. Jack stopped dead. A drone. They had drones. Shit. The kids panicked, pressing against the trees. Jack raised his rifle, tracking the movement overhead. It was circling, looking for heat signatures. Jack's mind raced. Think. Then he made a decision. He turned to Maddie. "Take them. Keep heading west. Stay under the trees." Maddie's hands were shaking. "What are you—" Jack cut her off. "I have to draw them off. Now move." She stared at him, her lip trembling. Jack softened his voice. "I'll find you." She nodded. Jack turned, sprinting into the darkness. The drone tracked him instantly. Jack wanted it to. He needed the men to follow him, not the kids. The forest blurred around him as he ran, his boots barely touching the ground. Gunfire ripped through the trees behind him. Jack kept moving. He had one chance, one shot at turning the hunt back on them, and when the time came, he would be ready. Jack Callahan ran like the devil himself was on his heels. The whine of the drone above cut through the night, a mechanical predator scanning for heat signatures. He could feel it tracking him, feeding his location to the men behind him. Boots thundered through the underbrush, voices barking commands over radios. He was being funneled, herded. They wanted him to run. Jack never ran. He was leading them. The forest blurred around him as he pushed through the terrain, his body moving on instinct, guided by years of muscle memory and survival training. He counted steps, mapped every dip in the ground, every fallen log, every exposed rock. The landscape wasn't an obstacle. It was a weapon waiting to be used. Jack cut right, angling toward a narrow ravine he had scouted months ago while hunting. It was steep, a 30-foot drop with jagged rocks waiting below. He had no intention of falling. His pursuers, though, they might not be so lucky. The drone shifted overhead, adjusting to his movement. Jack's breath stayed steady, his boots silent against the damp ground. He knew how they were tracking him, the heat from his body, which meant he needed to disappear, fast. He spotted what he was looking for, an old rotting tree trunk, its roots still clutching the earth. It was half-hollowed by decay, filled with thick, wet moss. Perfect. Jack slid inside, pressing himself against the damp wood, slowing his breathing. He closed his eyes, counted the seconds. 5. The drone hovered, its whine shifting pitch. 10. Shouts echoed through the trees. "He was right here! Spread out!" 15. The men moved past him, still hunting, still searching. 20. The drone drifted forward, scanning, then it moved on. Jack waited another 10 seconds. Then he slipped from the log, moving in the opposite direction. "Now it's my turn." Jack didn't just want to escape. He wanted to end this. He retraced his path carefully, circling back toward his hunters. He moved like a ghost, staying low, keeping his steps controlled. The first man was just ahead, his back turned, scanning the ridge with his rifle raised. Jack took his time. He approached silently, his knife already in hand. One quick movement, a sharp inhale, then silence. Jack lowered the body, taking the man's radio and thermal goggles. That's one. He kept moving. The second man was more cautious, his rifle raised, his movements slow. He knew something was wrong, but knowing wasn't enough. Jack used the darkness, slipping behind him like a shadow. The man barely had time to register movement before Jack's arm wrapped around his throat. A choked gasp, a struggle, then stillness. Jack took his rifle. Two down. The remaining men were closing in. Jack could hear them coordinating over the radio, their voices tight with frustration. He keyed the stolen mic, clicked it once. Silence. Then another click, a taunt, a challenge. It worked. One of the men cursed. Son of a bitch is still alive? Jack grinned. He moved fast, setting the trap. He found a clearing near the ravine's edge, leaving just enough disturbance in the ground to suggest movement. Then he positioned himself behind cover and waited. Minutes later, the first man arrived. His flashlight swept the area, his rifle held tight. He crouched, examining the ground, following the fake trail Jack had left. Jack moved behind him, silent as death. The man turned too late. A single, brutal strike. He went down without a sound. Jack took his radio, keyed the mic. This is your last chance. Static. Then, a voice. You don't understand what you're interfering with. Jack smiled coldly. I don't care. He moved again, keeping low, keeping silent. He could hear the last few men repositioning, trying to regroup. They were on edge now, scared. Good. Fear made people sloppy. Jack used that. He crept along the ridge, finding a vantage point overlooking their position. Three left. They were standing close together, scanning the forest. Jack lifted the stolen rifle, breathed in, breathed out, squeezed the trigger. One man dropped. The other two spun, shouting. Jack was already moving. He didn't need bullets for the last two. He needed speed. The second-to-last man was still scanning for movement when Jack crashed into him, knocking his rifle aside. A struggle, a fist to the throat, a knee to the ribs. The man collapsed. Jack turned. The last one was already running. Jack exhaled, lifted the rifle, then stopped. Let him go, let him run, because the message had already been sent. Jack stood over the bodies of the fallen men, his breath slow and steady. His hands were steady, his heart was steady. He had won, for now. But this wasn't over, because these weren't just random mercenaries. They had resources, they had tracking drones, they had a camp. And there were more children out there. Jack clenched his jaw. He turned. Moving fast. Maddie and Ben were still waiting, but after tonight, Jack knew exactly what he had to do next. He wasn't just going to run. He wasn't just going to hide. He was going to hunt, and he was going to burn their operation to the ground. Jack Callahan moved like a ghost through the forest, his boots whispering against the damp earth. The bodies of the men he had taken down lay behind him, cooling in the Montana night. He had left them where they fell, not out of carelessness, but as a message, a warning. He wasn't running. He was coming for them. By the time he reached the cave where Maddie and Ben were hidden, his adrenaline had settled into a slow, steady burn. He crouched near the entrance, his rifle still in his grip. "Maddie!" he called softly. No response. Jack's chest tightened. He moved inside, his pulse sharp against his ribs. Then, a small gasp. Maddie appeared from the shadows, her body rigid with fear. When she saw it was him, her shoulders sagged. "Jack? It's me," he confirmed. "You okay?" She nodded quickly, then pointed deeper into the cave. Jack stepped past her. Ben was curled in the farthest corner, his small frame shaking beneath the wool blanket Jack had given them. He wasn't crying. He wasn't making a sound. Jack exhaled slowly. The kid was retreating. Jack had seen it before, soldiers, civilians, even trained operatives. People who had seen too much, who had gone so deep inside themselves that they weren't sure if they'd ever come back. He crouched in front of the boy. "Ben," he said, keeping his voice low. "Nothing." Jack unzipped his go bag, pulling out a small protein bar. He unwrapped it, breaking off a piece. "Take this," he said, offering it. Ben didn't move. Jack glanced at Maddie. "You eat first." Maddie hesitated, then took the piece and chewed. She swallowed hard, then looked at her brother. "It's okay," she whispered. Ben's eyes flickered, then slowly his small hand reached out. He took the next piece of food. Jack let out a slow breath. "That's it, kid. Stay with me." But they weren't safe yet. Jack turned back to Maddie. "How many kids were at that camp?" Her lips trembled. "A lot." Jack's jaw flexed. He already knew the answer before he asked the next question. "Are they still there?" She nodded, biting her lip. "Yes." Jack exhaled through his nose. He needed more information, and he knew exactly how to get it. Jack led them deeper into the forest, moving fast but careful. The night wasn't over, and there was still work to do. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to send a message. They reached a small, abandoned hunting outpost, an old wooden structure Jack had used a few times while scouting. It was elevated, the perfect place to regroup. Maddie and Ben sat on the wooden floor, exhaustion weighing them down. Jack kept watch near the entrance, his rifle resting against his knee. Then he pulled out the stolen radio, clicked it on, static. Then a voice. "Repeat. Do you have eyes on the target?" Silence. Jack clicked the mic. "No," he said, his voice a quiet growl. A pause. "Then who is this?" Jack's lips curled. "The man you sent to die," he said. Silence. Then another voice, calm, deliberate. "I take it you're the one who disrupted our retrieval." Jack's grip on the radio tightened. Retrieval. Not hunt, not kill. They weren't out here to eliminate Maddie and Ben. They were out here to bring them back. Jack's stomach coiled. He had been right. This was bigger than some local operation. This was organized, and it was still active. Jack keyed the mic again. "They're not yours anymore," he said, his voice low. A pause. Then the voice on the other end chuckled. "You're making a mistake." Jack's eyes burned cold. "No," he said, "you made the mistake." Then he crushed the radio under his boot. Message sent. Jack turned to Maddie. "That camp, where is it?" Maddie swallowed. "I don't know exactly," she admitted. They took us in a truck. We were in there for a long time." Jack's mind worked quickly. "Did you see any signs, hear anything?" She hesitated, thinking. Then, "There was a smell," she said, "like oil and something burning." Jack's jaw tightened. That gave him something. "What else?" Maddie closed her eyes. "A train," she whispered. "I heard a train. It wasn't far. That was enough." Jack knew the rail lines in this part of Montana. If they were close enough to hear a train, they had to be within a certain range. Factor in the smell of oil, probably an industrial site, maybe an old refinery. Jack had a pretty good idea where to start looking, and when he found that camp, he was going to burn it to the ground. Jack didn't sleep that night. He kept watch while Maddie and Ben curled up together, their breathing finally evening out. He let them rest. They would need their strength, because tomorrow, Jack Callahan was going to war. Jack Callahan watched over Maddie and Ben as they slept, their small bodies curled together for warmth on the floor of the hunting outpost. The night had settled into an eerie stillness, but Jack didn't let his guard down. He hadn't slept. He wouldn't. Somewhere out there, the men who had taken these kids were regrouping. They weren't just mercenaries. They were trained, organized, and they weren't going to let two lost children slip through their fingers. Jack had fought men like this before. He knew how they operated, and he knew exactly how to hurt them. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, Jack had a plan. It was dangerous, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. He crouched beside Maddie and shook her shoulder gently. She startled awake, eyes wide with panic before she registered who he was. "Hey," Jack said, his voice steady. "It's morning. We have to move." She blinked rapidly, then turned toward her brother. Ben was still asleep, his small face tight with exhaustion. Jack exhaled. The kid had barely spoken, barely reacted to anything. That wasn't good. "Ben," Jack murmured, nudging him lightly. "Time to wake up, buddy." The boy stirred but didn't answer. Maddie swallowed hard. "He's really tired." Jack nodded. "I know, but we have to go. We can't stay here." Maddie bit her lip but didn't argue. She shook her brother gently, whispering something to him. Slowly he stirred. Jack pulled a protein bar from his bag and handed it to Maddie. "Make him eat." She nodded and started breaking off small pieces for her brother. Jack turned back to the entrance, scanning the tree line. They had to move. Now. By mid-morning, Jack had led them deep into the forest, heading toward higher ground. He needed to see the land, needed to find the best way to reach the camp Maddie had described. But first, he needed to be sure they weren't being followed. He moved with practiced efficiency, keeping the kids close, making them step where he stepped, never breaking pace. Maddie kept up. Ben struggled. Jack could hear the boy's small gasps, his feet dragging, but he didn't complain. The kid had been through hell. Jack respected that. "Almost there," he murmured. "Not much farther." It was a lie. They still had miles to go, but sometimes people needed to believe the end was in sight. By the time they reached the top of the ridge, Jack had his answer. They were still being hunted. He could see them far below, small dark figures moving through the trees. They weren't rushing anymore, they were tracking, which meant they had found something. Jack clenched his jaw. The bodies. They had found their dead, and now they were hunting him with renewed purpose. Good, he wanted them to. Jack turned to Maddie. "Stay low, don't move." She obeyed instantly, pulling Ben close beside her. Jack dropped onto his stomach and pulled his rifle up, using the scope to get a better look. 6 men, more than he expected. They were sweeping through the area in a slow, deliberate formation. That wasn't random, that was military. And it told Jack something important. This wasn't just some human trafficking ring. This was bigger, dirtier, more connected. These men weren't worried about the police. They were the police. Or at least had people on their payroll. Jack exhaled slowly. That changed things. He needed to move carefully, but he also needed answers, which meant he needed to get closer. He led Maddie and Ben farther down the ridge, keeping them in the thickest cover. Then he stopped near a narrow pass between the rocks. "This is where we split," Jack said. Maddie's eyes widened. "What?" Jack crouched in front of her. "I need to go down there and find out more about these guys. But I can't do that with you two next to me." She shook her head violently. No, you said you wouldn't leave us." Jack's voice stayed calm. "I won't be gone long, but if I don't do this, we won't know what we're up against." Maddie's face twisted with fear. "But you can do this," Jack said firmly. "Take Ben, keep moving west, stay low, stay quiet. I'll find you." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her fingers curling into fists, but she nodded. She trusted him. Jack squeezed her shoulder. "Good girl." Then he turned, moving back toward the hunters. He stalked them from a distance, moving parallel to their path. They weren't talking much. Professionals, no wasted movement. Jack crept closer, close enough to hear. One of them spoke into a radio. "We've lost them again." A voice on the other end crackled through. "Unacceptable." Jack's jaw tightened. That voice. It was the same one from the radio last night. The leader. Jack inched closer. "They won't get far," another man muttered. The radio crackled again. "I don't want excuses. I want results." Silence. Then a chilling order. "If you don't recover the children, kill them." Jack's pulse went ice cold. The men nodded grimly and moved out. Jack inhaled slowly, and then for the first time in 3 years, he felt something dark unfurl inside him. A monster he had kept buried, a killer. These men weren't going to stop, which meant Jack was going to have to put every single one of them in the ground. Jack moved fast, retracing his steps. By the time he reached Maddie and Ben, his heart was pounding, but his face was unreadable. Maddie looked up at him, eyes wide. "Jack, we have to move," he said flatly. Something in his tone must have told her everything she needed to know. She didn't argue. She just grabbed Ben's hand and they ran. By the time the sun set, they were miles away. Jack had led them to a small outcropping of rocks, giving them temporary shelter. Maddie collapsed onto the ground, pulling Ben against her. Jack stayed standing, watching, waiting. He was done running. Tomorrow he was going back to that camp, and he was going to make sure no one ever took another child from it again, because he wasn't just a soldier, he was a hunter. And these bastards, they were already dead. Jack Callahan had spent the last few years trying to forget the man he used to be, the man who had taken lives with precision, the man who had tracked enemies through jungles and deserts, slipping through the cracks of war like a shadow, leaving bodies in his wake, the man who never left anyone behind, anyone. But standing at the edge of a ridgeline, staring down at the smouldering remains of what Maddie had only been able to describe as the camp, Jack knew one thing for certain. That man wasn't dead. He was just waking up. The fire had burned hot, too hot. Jack could smell it even from here, the acrid scent of gasoline, scorched metal, melted plastic. The remains of structures, barely recognizable through the smoke, sat in ruins. It wasn't just abandoned, it had been wiped clean. Jack's mind worked fast. Whoever had been running this operation hadn't just packed up and left. They had erased it, covered their tracks. And that meant one thing. They had been expecting him. His stomach tightened. How long have they been watching? Maddie stood beside him, her small fists clenched at her sides. She was breathing hard, her eyes locked on the destruction below. "It's gone," she whispered. Jack nodded. "Yeah." "But," she swallowed, shaking her head. "The others, the other kids, they were here. I know they were." Jack exhaled slowly. "I believe you." Maddie turned toward him, desperate. "Then where are they?" Jack didn't answer, because he already knew. They had been moved, not freed, not rescued, just relocated. And that meant the operation wasn't over. Not even close. Jack scanned the wreckage, his sharp eyes picking apart the details. The fire had been controlled, intentional. The main structures were gone, but the outer areas hadn't burned as completely. Whoever had done this had wanted to destroy evidence, not everything. Jack turned back to Maddie and Ben, who stood huddled together, waiting for him to decide what came next. They were looking at him like he had the answers, like he could fix this. Jack clenched his jaw. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going down." Maddie's eyes widened. "But," he shook his head, "no arguments. If something goes wrong, you take Ben and you run." She hesitated, then nodded. Jack nodded back. Then he moved. The descent was rough. The slope was steep, loose rocks making every step treacherous. Jack moved carefully, keeping low, his rifle tight against his chest. When he reached the outskirts of the burned camp, he crouched behind a charred support beam, scanning for movement. Nothing. The place was dead. Jack moved deeper. The fire had done its job well. What hadn't burned had been torn apart, stripped down. No bodies, no tracks, just blackened earth and smoldering wood. But something felt off. Jack trusted that feeling. It had kept him alive more times than he could count. He moved to the largest pile of wreckage, what had probably been a main structure before the fire consumed it. Then he saw it, a metal shipping container, mostly intact. The fire had blackened its edges, but the steel was still standing. Jack's gut twisted. These kinds of operations didn't run out of abandoned buildings or shacks. They ran out of mobile sites, places they could disappear in an instant, which meant this wasn't just a camp, it had been a transfer point, and the container might hold something the fire hadn't destroyed. Jack moved fast, keeping his ears sharp for the sound of approaching footsteps. Nothing. He reached the container. The door was warped from heat, but it was still shut. Jack ran his fingers over the latch. It wasn't locked. He took a slow breath, then yanked it open. The stench hit him first. Rot, sweat, faint traces of blood. Jack's stomach clenched. Inside, the container was empty, but the walls were covered in scratches, small ones, from fingernails. Jack felt something deep in his chest tighten. He had seen a lot of evil in his time, but nothing ever compared to this. He turned away, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. His hands curled into fists, nails biting into his palms. He breathed, forced himself to think. The camp was a ghost now. The children were gone, but someone had done this, and Jack was going to find them. By the time he reached Maddie and Ben again, his face was unreadable. Maddie looked up at him, eyes full of desperate hope. "Did you find—" Jack shook his head. Her face crumpled. Jack crouched in front of her. "Listen to me." She looked at him, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. "They moved them," he said. "That means they still need them alive." Maddie's breath hitched. Jack kept his voice steady. "We're not done," he said. "Not even close." Maddie wiped at her eyes. "Where do we go?" she whispered. Jack stood, scanning the horizon. "We go after them." Maddie frowned. "But we don't know where they went." Jack turned back to her. "Yes, we do. Because Jack wasn't just going to find the people who did this. He was going to hunt them down. And when he did, there wouldn't be enough of them left to fill a body bag." Jack Callahan had spent years designing and executing kill zones in war zones across the world. He knew how to lure an enemy in, how to make them think they had the upper hand, and, most importantly, how to end them. By the time Maddie and Ben were settled in a hidden grove off the main trail, Jack had already started preparing. He moved with quiet efficiency, scanning the burned-out remains of the camp, calculating angles, escape routes, and the likeliest approach paths of the men coming for him. Because they would come. Jack had left enough of a mess behind to make sure of that. They'd want confirmation. They'd want him. But Jack was done running. Now he was waiting. The first thing he did was strip the bodies of the men he had taken out. He needed supplies, radios, ammunition, anything that could be used against their own people. Then he set up a series of false trails leading outward from the burned site. Broken branches, boot tracks in the dirt, enough to suggest movement in multiple directions, anything to buy time. He rigged small sound traps with wire and spent shell casings, primitive but effective. The kind of trick an impatient soldier might dismiss, but a cautious one would stop to check, and stopping meant slowing down. Jack needed them slow, because he would not be. By late afternoon he was ready, and all that was left to do was wait. Maddie and Ben were still in the grove when he returned, their small forms tucked against each other. Maddie looked up, eyes searching his face. "What now?" Jack crouched beside her. "Now we sit tight." She bit her lip. "Are they coming?" Jack nodded. She swallowed. "Are we going to run?" Jack shook his head. "No," he said. "They are." Maddie's brows furrowed in confusion. But she didn't ask any more questions. She just trusted him. That was enough. The first sign of their arrival came just after sundown. A low hum in the distance. Engines, not loud, not rushing, controlled. They were approaching carefully. Jack lay flat against the ridge, scanning the tree line. He counted 2 SUVs, moving in staggered formation. Tinted windows, reinforced grills, military grade. Jack exhaled slowly. These aren't your average traffickers. They had funding, which meant they had connections, which meant they had to be wiped out. Jack keyed the stolen radio, listening. The first voice came through. "We're approaching now, no movement yet." Another voice, colder, more direct. "Confirm bodies." Jack's jaw tightened. They were making sure their men were dead, which meant they hadn't recovered them yet, which meant they were close. Jack kept his breathing slow, steady. Let them think they were in control. Let them feel safe. Then he would take them apart, piece by piece. The SUVs rolled to a stop near the wreckage of the camp. Doors opened. 4 men stepped out. Jack watched through his rifle scope, cataloging details. They moved with practiced caution, rifles up, eyes scanning. Their gear was clean, coordinated. Black fatigues, reinforced tactical vests, suppressed weapons. Professional, trained, but not prepared, because they had no idea what kind of monster they were walking into. Jack waited. They approached the burned-out structures, moving in slow, methodical sweeps. One man stopped near the shipping container. Jack adjusted his aim. His finger hovered over the trigger. Not yet, not yet. Then the second SUV's back door opened, and a man stepped out. Not just any man. Him. The voice from the radio. The leader. Jack felt something cold settle inside him. He moved the rifle's scope, tracking the man. He was older than the others, late 40s maybe, but still built like a man who had spent his life in combat. His movements were efficient, deliberate, not a mercenary, not a grunt, a commander. Jack's heartbeat slowed. Target acquired. The leader stopped near the other men, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and spoke. His voice was exactly the same as it had been over the radio, calm, detached. "Find him!" Jack took the shot. The bullet struck the first man through the throat. A wet gurgle, then silence. Chaos erupted. Shouts, movement. Jack was already moving, shifting positions before they could zero in on his location. Suppressive fire tore through the trees where he had been moments ago. They were fast, not fast enough. Jack dropped the second man with a clean shot through the chest. "Two down!" The leader reacted instantly. Jack watched him through the scope, analyzing his response. No panic, no wasted movement. He gestured sharply toward the SUVs, and the remaining men started to reposition. Jack clicked his tongue. Smart, but not smart enough. Jack threw his first trap. A tripwire snapped, triggering a burst of sound. Empty shell casings clattering against metal. The closest man flinched. Jack took the shot. 3 down. The leader didn't flinch. He just exhaled and lifted his radio. Jack knew what was coming. "Send backup," the man ordered. Jack clenched his jaw. That was not an option. He moved, fast. The remaining men had taken cover behind the SUVs, their rifles scanning the ridge. Jack slid down the embankment, keeping low. He slung his rifle onto his back, pulled his knife. This wasn't about sniping anymore. This was up close. This was silent. This was Jack Callahan at his most dangerous. The man closest to the SUV was focused on the tree line. Jack came from the side. One arm wrapped around his throat, the other drove the knife deep. A sharp inhale, then silence. Jack eased the body down. 4 down. The leader knew now. Jack could see it, the shift in posture, the way his hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just a recovery mission anymore. This was personal. Good. So was Jack's. Jack moved fast, slipping behind the second SUV. The last guard barely had time to react before Jack was on him. A brutal, silent takedown. 5 down. Now it was just Jack. And the leader. The man turned. His eyes found Jack's. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not fear, recognition. "You," he murmured. Jack didn't hesitate. He lifted his stolen rifle and leveled it at the man's chest. The leader exhaled. Then he smiled. "You have no idea what you've started." Jack pulled the trigger. Click. Jack's eyes flickered down. "Empty," the leader chuckled. Jack didn't give him the chance to enjoy it. He lunged. They crashed together, a brutal tangle of fists and elbows. The man was strong, but Jack was stronger. He twisted, using the man's own weight to slam him into the SUV. A sharp grunt. Jack drove his fist into the man's ribs, feeling something crack. The man staggered. Jack grabbed his collar and pulled him close. "Where did you take them?" Jack growled. The man's bloody lips curled into a smirk. "You're too late." Jack's jaw clenched. Then he slammed the man's head into the SUV, again and again, and when he was done, the only thing left was silence. The hunt wasn't over, but Jack knew where to go next, and this time he wouldn't stop until every last one of them was dead. Jack Callahan stood over the unconscious body of the man who had orchestrated the hunt for Maddie and Ben. Blood dripped from the leader's split forehead, pooling beneath his head on the dirt. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Jack could kill him. It would be easy. He'd done worse to men like him. But killing him wouldn't get Jack what he needed. Where were the kids? Jack clenched his jaw and inhaled slowly, forcing down the rage seething in his gut. He grabbed the man's radio, turning the dial to scan the channels. Static. Then a voice crackled through. "Status check. Cargo is ready for transport. ETA to final location. 30 minutes. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. 30 minutes. That was all the time he had. The others were already gone. The kids were already being moved. Jack had been too late, but not too late to catch them. Jack crouched down and grabbed the leader by his collar, jerking his limp body upward. His head lolled back, dazed, but Jack gave him no time to recover. "Where are they taking them?" Jack's voice was calm, controlled. The man coughed, spitting blood onto the dirt, then chuckled. "You can't stop it." Jack slammed him against the SUV. Hard. "Try again," Jack growled. The leader's expression twisted into something between amusement and pain. "You think this ends with one transport truck?" He let out a wet laugh. "You don't even know who you're fighting." Jack clenched his jaw, then pressed the barrel of his pistol under the man's chin. "Tell me," Jack said, his voice dangerously low, "or I swear to God, I'll make sure the last thing you feel is my knife carving the answers out of you." The leader hesitated. Jack could see it, the calculation in his eyes. He thought he was still in control, that he could still manipulate the situation. Jack wasn't bluffing. The leader swallowed thickly, his body shuddering. "South. They're moving them south, toward a private airstrip. If they get airborne, you'll never see them again." Jack processed the information fast. The airstrip, he knew where that was. Knew. But he didn't know how much of what the man was telling him was true. Jack narrowed his eyes. "How many men?" The leader's lips twisted into a bloody grin. "Enough to make you regret this." Jack exhaled slowly. Then he pulled back and slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's face. The leader crumpled. Unconscious again, Jack let him drop to the dirt. He was done wasting time. Jack turned away from the wreckage, moving fast. Maddie and Ben were still waiting, but 30 minutes wasn't enough time. Jack was running out of options. He needed help. By the time Jack reached Maddie and Ben's hiding place, the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows through the trees. Maddie looked up, her face drawn with worry. "Jack?" He crouched in front of her, his eyes sharp. "We don't have time to argue. I need you to trust me." Maddie swallowed hard, but nodded. Jack exhaled. "There's a truck. It's moving south. The kids from the camp are inside. We have 30 minutes before they're gone for good." Maddie's eyes widened. "You're going after them?" "Yes, but—" Jack put a hand on her shoulder. "Listen, I need to get you and Ben somewhere safe first." Her hands curled into fists. "No, we're going with you." Jack shook his head. "Maddie!" She stepped forward, her jaw tight. "I'm not leaving them behind again!" Jack met her gaze. The determination in her eyes was something fierce. He could argue. He could force them to stay behind. But Maddie wasn't backing down. Jack exhaled. "Then stay close." They moved fast. Jack knew the layout of the area well. There was an old service road that cut through the forest, leading toward the airstrip. If he could intercept the truck before it reached the main highway, he had a chance, a small chance. But that was all he needed. By the time they reached the road, Jack had already worked through the possible outcomes in his mind. The truck wouldn't be unguarded. They wouldn't stop just because he waved them down. Jack needed to force a stop. He spotted a fallen tree near the bend in the road, too thick for any vehicle to plow through. Perfect. "Maddie, Ben, get behind cover." Maddie hesitated, but Jack didn't have time to argue. "Now!" She grabbed Ben and ducked behind a cluster of rocks. Jack moved fast, dragging a series of logs and debris into the middle of the road. It wouldn't stop them completely, but it would slow them. And slowing down meant making them vulnerable. Jack positioned himself behind an outcropping of rock. Rifle braced, heart steady, then he waited. Minutes passed. Then the sound of an engine. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. The truck appeared around the bend, its headlights cutting through the trees. It slowed, then stopped. Jack could hear voices inside. A door opened. One of the guards stepped out, frowning at the blockade in the road. Jack watched through his scope, lining up his shot. The second guard stepped out, rifle raised. Jack took the first shot. The guard dropped before he could react. The second spun, reaching for his radio. Jack fired again. Another body hit the dirt. Shouts erupted from the back of the truck. Jack didn't wait. He moved, fast. He sprinted forward, keeping low, reaching the driver's side before the man inside could react. Jack yanked the door open, dragged the driver out, and slammed his fist into his jaw. The man crumpled. Jack swung up into the cab. The keys were still in the ignition. Jack floored it. The truck lurched forward, plowing through the debris in the road. He could hear pounding from the cargo hold behind him. The kids. Jack didn't slow down, didn't stop. They weren't safe yet, but they were his now, and no one was taking them from him, not ever again. Jack Callahan gripped the steering wheel tight, his knuckles turning white as the massive truck rumbled forward down the winding mountain road. Behind him, the cargo hold was filled with terrified, stolen children. Ahead of him, the enemy was coming, and time was running out. Maddie and Ben sat beside him in the cab, Maddie still breathless from sprinting to the truck. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice raw. "Somewhere safe," Jack muttered. It was a lie. There was nowhere safe, not yet. Jack didn't just need to escape, he needed to end this. The radio crackled beside him, a familiar voice. "You really think you're getting away?" Jack didn't answer. The leader, the man who had ordered these kids into cages, was still alive, and he wasn't going to let his investment slip through his fingers. "You don't even know what you've done," the voice continued, cold and calm. Jack reached for the radio, pressing the mic. "I know exactly what I've done." A pause. Then laughter. "Then you know we're coming for you." Jack exhaled through his nose. "Then come," he said, "and bring body bags." He tossed the radio aside. Maddie was gripping the dashboard, her eyes darting toward him. "Jack, they're going to catch us." She was right. Jack had killed their men. He had stolen their shipment. They wouldn't stop, not until they had everything back. Jack's jaw tightened. Then he slammed his foot on the gas. The truck barreled down the mountain pass, gravel spitting from its tires. Jack gritted his teeth, muscles tense, as he handled the heavy machine through each sharp turn. Then, through the side mirror, headlights, a convoy of SUVs kicking up dust behind him. They had found him, and they were closing in. Jack's mind worked fast. He couldn't outrun them forever, and he sure as hell wasn't going to surrender. That left him with one option. He had to fight. Jack reached under the seat, feeling for what he had seen earlier, his fingers wrapped around it, a flare gun. He yanked it free, shoving it into Maddie's hands. "Open the window," he ordered. She hesitated. Jack's voice hardened. "Now." She obeyed, cranking the handle until the wind roared into the cab. Jack didn't take his eyes off the road. "When I say, fire it straight at the first car." Maddie's hands trembled around the grip. "Will it stop them?" Jack didn't answer, because he didn't know. The first SUV pulled closer. A rifle barrel poked out the passenger window. Jack jerked the wheel at the last second, forcing the truck into the opposing lane. Gunfire erupted. Bullets pinged off the side of the truck. Maddie yelped, ducking. Jack growled, yanking her back up. "Focus!" She swallowed hard, gripping the flare gun tighter. The SUV lined up for another shot. "Now!" Jack barked. Maddie fired. The bright red flare streaked through the air, slamming into the SUV's windshield. The vehicle jerked, swerving wildly, then smashed into the guardrail, flipping over the edge of the road. Jack didn't look. One down. More to go. The second SUV pulled alongside the truck, trying to force him off the road. Jack clenched his jaw. They wanted to box him in, pin him down. Not happening. Jack wrenched the wheel hard to the right, slamming the truck into the SUV. The metal screeched, tires screamed. The SUV spun out, crashing sideways into the trees. Jack exhaled, 2 down. But the last one was still coming. And it was the biggest threat of all, because Jack recognized the silhouette behind the wheel, the leader. The final SUV stayed back, holding position. Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. The man was smart. He wasn't going to rush in. Jack knew exactly what he was waiting for. Backup. Jack's mind raced. He was running out of road and time. Then, up ahead, he saw it, an old bridge. It stretched over a narrow canyon, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. Jack's stomach clenched. It was a choke point, a place where he could make a final stand. His hands flexed around the steering wheel. Time to end this. Jack pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck roared as it surged toward the bridge. The SUV behind him sped up, keeping pace. Jack exhaled slowly. He had one shot, one move. He tightened his grip, then slammed the brakes. The truck lurched violently. The SUV didn't react fast enough. It swerved too late and slammed into the back of the truck at full speed. Metal crunched, glass shattered. The impact sent the SUV spinning wildly, right off the edge of the bridge. Jack watched through the mirror as it tumbled down and exploded against the canyon floor. Silence. Nothing but the wind howling through the trees. Jack exhaled. It was over. Maddie sat frozen, her chest rising and falling in rapid gasps. Jack turned to her. "You okay?" She nodded barely. Jack looked at Ben, still silent, still numb. Jack swallowed hard. He had saved them, but they weren't safe. Not yet. The truck rolled to a stop at the far end of the bridge. Jack climbed out, his boots hitting the ground hard. He walked to the back, yanking the cargo doors open. Inside, a dozen small faces stared back at him. Wide, scared, hopeful. Jack let out a slow breath. Then he smiled. "You're safe now," he said. For the first time, one of the kids started crying, and Jack knew his job wasn't over. Not yet. Because the men who did this, the men behind all of this, Jack was coming for them next, and he was never going to stop. Jack Callahan stood at the back of the truck, scanning the frightened faces inside. A dozen kids, some barely older than Ben, others in their early teens, all staring at him with wide, hollow eyes. They had been locked in darkness, convinced they were being taken somewhere worse. Jack had just become their savior, but they weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. Maddie stepped beside him, gripping the edge of the cargo doors. She swallowed hard. "There were more," she whispered. "Back at the camp." Jack nodded. "I know." Maddie's lip trembled, but she squared her shoulders. "We have to go back for them." Jack placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "First, we make sure these kids don't end up in another truck." Maddie hesitated, then nodded. Jack turned back to the truck. "Everyone, listen up." The kids flinched. Jack softened his tone. "My name is Jack. I need you all to stay quiet and stay together. We're getting you out of here, but I need you to trust me." A boy in the back, maybe 11 years old, lifted his chin. "Are you the police?" Jack's jaw clenched. "No," the boy frowned. "Then who are you?" Jack exhaled. "The guy who's making sure this doesn't happen again." The problem was the truck. It was too big, too slow. The wreckage on the bridge would buy them time, but not much. Jack needed another vehicle, and he needed it fast. He turned to Maddie. "Stay with them, I'll be right back." Her eyes widened. "Where are you going?" Jack was already moving. "To find us a ride." He jogged down the dirt road, scanning ahead. The forest pressed in on either side. A narrow path. No real turn-offs. Then a flicker of movement. Jack slowed. He pressed himself against a tree, listening. An engine. Close. He edged forward, peering through the underbrush. Then he saw it. An ATV, parked just off the road, still warm. A single guard leaning against it, rifle slung over his shoulder. Jack exhaled. Too easy. The man never heard him coming. Jack moved fast, grabbing him from behind. A sharp twist, a silent snap. The body slumped. Jack didn't stop moving. He dragged the body into the trees, stripped it of weapons and gear, then swung onto the ATV. The engine purred beneath him. Jack smirked. Perfect. By the time he reached the truck again, Maddie was pacing. She froze when she saw him. "You found something?" Jack nodded. "Enough to get us out of here." He turned to the kids. "We're switching rides, everyone out." They hesitated. Jack clenched his jaw. "I need you to move." Now! That got them going. One by one, they climbed out, their feet crunching on gravel. Maddie helped Ben down, then looked up at Jack. "We all can't fit on that thing," she said, nodding toward the ATV. Jack agreed, which meant he needed a new plan. He spotted a pickup truck hidden near the tree line, partially covered in camouflage netting. Smart, but not smart enough. Jack moved fast, yanking open the door. The keys were still in the ignition. Good. He turned back to Maddie. "Load them in." She obeyed without question. Within minutes, the kids were packed into the truck bed, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. Jack climbed into the driver's seat. Maddie slid in beside him, Ben on her lap. Jack exhaled. "Hold on." The truck peeled out, tires spitting dirt as Jack gunned it down the road. They had a chance now. But they weren't free yet, because in the mirror, Jack saw headlights. And they were gaining. Jack gritted his teeth. More of them. They weren't stopping until every last one of these kids was dead or back in a cage. Jack clenched the wheel tighter. Not happening. Maddie twisted in her seat. "They're coming." Jack didn't answer. He focused, calculated, then made his move. He yanked the wheel hard, sending the truck skidding onto a back road. The SUVs followed. Jack knew this land. They didn't. He used that. He took sharp turns, weaving through dense tree lines. But the SUVs kept coming, too close, too fast. Jack's mind raced. How do I end this? Then he saw it, a ravine, deep, narrow, and a single wooden bridge crossing it. Jack smirked. "That'll do." Jack gunned the engine. The truck flew onto the bridge, its frame rattling. The SUVs followed. Jack waited. Then he jerked the wheel. The truck spun sideways, blocking the exit. The first SUV swerved. Too late. It slammed into the side, its tires screeching, then flipped. Jack watched it tumble into the ravine, metal twisting on impact. One down. The second SUV stopped, just short of the wreckage. Jack jumped out of the truck, rifle raised. The driver did the same. Then Jack saw him, the leader, still alive, still chasing him. Jack's eyes burned. The leader smirked. "You can't stop this," he said. Jack exhaled slowly. Then he pulled the trigger. The shot slammed into the man's shoulder. He staggered. Jack was already moving. He reached him before he could react, driving a fist into his ribs. The leader gasped. Jack didn't stop. A second punch. A third. The man dropped to his knees, choking on blood. Jack grabbed him by the collar. "You took children," he growled. "You sold them." The man coughed. Jack pressed his rifle against his forehead. "Where are the rest?" Jack demanded. The leader's lips curled. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. Then a small voice. "Jack." Jack froze. Maddie was standing behind him, watching. Her hands were clenched into fists, but her eyes, they weren't angry. They weren't scared. They were pleading. Jack exhaled. Then he let go. The leader slumped, barely conscious. Jack turned, grabbing a pair of zip ties from the wreckage. He bound the man's wrists, shoving him to the ground. "Someone's going to want to talk to you," Jack muttered. The leader's smirk faded. For the first time, Jack saw fear in his eyes. "Good." Jack turned back to Maddie. Her face was unreadable. "Are they safe?" he asked. She nodded. Jack exhaled. It was over, for now. The headlights of approaching vehicles cut through the trees. Not enemies. This time, it was law enforcement, the real kind. Jack Callahan had just torn apart one of the largest trafficking networks in the country, and now the rest of the world would finally see it. Jack turned to Maddie and Ben. He crouched in front of them, his voice soft. "You're safe now," he said. Maddie hesitated. Then she hugged him. Jack closed his eyes. It was over. But he knew, for him, the hunt would never end. Jack Callahan watched the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the shattered remains of the bridge. The local law enforcement had arrived, drawn by the wreckage, the bodies, and the chaos he had left in his wake. But Jack knew better than to trust them. Not yet. He kept his rifle tight against his chest, his stance solid. The rescued children, Maddie, Ben, and the rest, huddled together near the truck, their small faces tight with fear. One mistake, one wrong move, and they could be taken again. Jack wasn't going to let that happen. Not ever. The first officer stepped out of his cruiser, his expression sharp as he scanned the scene. A younger deputy followed, his hand twitching near his holster. "Jesus," the older officer muttered, looking at the bodies, the overturned SUV, and the wreckage of what used to be a bridge. His eyes finally landed on Jack. "You responsible for this?" Jack didn't flinch. "Depends who's asking." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Sheriff Daniels, this is my jurisdiction. You want to tell me what the hell is going on here?" Jack exhaled. "How about you tell me?" He tilted his head toward the unconscious leader tied up near the wreckage. "That man was running a child trafficking ring out of a hidden camp not 10 miles from here, and I don't see a single missing person alert for any of these kids." Daniel's expression didn't change. "That true?" Jack nodded. "Can you prove it?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Talk to the kids," he said flatly. Or he nudged the tied-up leader with his boot. "Ask him." Daniels exhaled through his nose. Then he turned toward his deputies. "Get some blankets, Walter. Get these kids checked out." Jack didn't relax. Not yet. As the deputies moved, Jack grabbed Maddie's arm gently. "Stay close to Ben," he murmured. Her fingers curled into his sleeve. "You're not leaving, right?" Jack's expression didn't shift. "Not yet." Maddie bit her lip but nodded. Jack squeezed her shoulder, then turned back to Daniels. "We need to talk." The sheriff leaned against his cruiser, arms crossed. Jack didn't waste time. "The operation isn't over," he said. "The camp was burned, but they moved the kids before I could get to them." Daniels nodded, listening. Jack studied him carefully. "Some of your men in on it?" Daniels' jaw tightened. Jack had his answer. "I inherited a mess," the sheriff admitted. "Not everyone in this county's clean, but I don't tolerate this." Jack nodded once. "Good." Daniel's eyes flicked toward the unconscious leader. "Who is he?" Jack shrugged. "You tell me." Daniels exhaled. "We'll run his prints, see what comes back. But something tells me this bastard's got a lot of fake IDs. Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. "You need to move fast. They won't let him stay in custody long." Daniels frowned. "Who's they?" Jack shook his head. "Not local thugs. This is bigger, organized, high up." Daniels cursed under his breath. Jack turned away, scanning the horizon. "They're going to come for him, and for those kids." Daniels straightened. "We can put them in protective custody." Jack laughed, cold and humorless. "If you do that, they'll disappear in 24 hours. Daniels exhaled. Jack's voice dropped. "They have people inside the system. If you want these kids to live, you need to keep them off the grid." Daniels nodded slowly. Then he turned to his men. "We're taking these kids to my ranch," he ordered. "No hospitals, no reports. We do this quiet." Jack watched him carefully. Daniels met his gaze. "You trust me?" the sheriff asked. Jack didn't blink. "No," Daniels smirked. "Good." The convoy moved out. Jack stayed in the rear truck. Maddie and Ben pressed close to him. The rescued kids sat around them, still silent, still wary. They didn't believe they were safe yet. Neither did Jack. Halfway down the highway, Jack's gut tightened. Something was wrong. Too quiet. He scanned the rearview mirror. Then his blood ran cold. A black SUV, no headlights, moving fast. Jack's hands curled into fists. They weren't done yet. Jack leaned forward, knocking on the dashboard. "Daniels!" The sheriff's voice crackled over the radio. "I see it." Jack exhaled slowly. "We're about to have company." Daniels cursed. "How many?" Jack tracked the mirror. Another set of headlights appeared. Then another. 3 SUVs. At least 10 men. Jack's jaw flexed. "We're boxed in." Daniels didn't hesitate. "Everyone hold." The first SUV rammed into the back of the convoy. The truck jolted. The kids screamed. Jack wrapped an arm around Ben and Maddie, holding them steady. Then he grabbed his rifle. "Stay down," he ordered. Maddie's eyes were wide. "Jack, I've got this," he muttered. Then he shoved the door open and stepped out onto the highway. The SUVs roared forward. Jack raised his rifle, breathed in, breathed out, and fired. The first bullet shattered the windshield. The SUV swerved, tires screaming against the pavement. Jack adjusted, tracking the second vehicle. Another shot, a hit. The second SUV slammed into the guardrail, flipping violently. Jack turned to the third. Too late. Gunfire erupted. Jack dove behind the truck as bullets pinged off the metal. Daniels's voice cut through the radio. "Hold them here." Jack's grip tightened. "Copy." Jack moved, fast. He slid under the truck, rolling into a crouch behind the wheel well. The last SUV stopped. The doors opened. Jack counted 6. Not good. Then, a voice. "You should have just let them go." Jack exhaled, and then he smiled. "Come and get me." The first man stepped forward. Jack fired. He dropped. The second charged. Jack ducked low, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted. A snap. The third swung at him. Jack caught the punch, drove his knee into the man's stomach, then slammed his head against the truck. 3 down, 3 left. Jack turned, ready. Then a gun clicked behind his head. "Drop it," Jack clenched his jaw. The man behind him pressed the barrel deeper against his skull. "You've been a pain in the ass," the man muttered. Jack didn't move, didn't blink. The man chuckled. "Should have stayed retired, old man." Jack smirked. Then, from inside the truck, a gunshot. The man behind Jack jerked, blood spraying from his chest. Jack spun. The man collapsed. Jack blinked, turned, and saw Maddie standing in the truck bed, holding a smoking pistol. She was breathing hard, shaking, but her grip was steady. Jack stared at her. She stared back. Then she whispered, "I wasn't gonna let them take us again." Jack exhaled, and for the first time in years, he felt something deep in his chest. Not just anger, not just vengeance, something else. Hope. But the fight wasn't over. Because the men behind this, they still thought they were untouchable. Jack was about to prove them wrong. The bodies still lay cooling on the asphalt, their weapons scattered, their blood staining the highway under the fading light. The fight was over. For now. Jack Callahan stood in the wreckage, his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the chaos left in his wake. The kids, Maddie, Ben, and the others, were still huddled inside the truck, their eyes wide, their bodies stiff with shock. Maddie stood outside, her small hands still gripping the pistol she had fired. The adrenaline that had steadied her hands before was fading, leaving only shaking fingers and shallow breaths. Jack took a step toward her carefully. She flinched, not out of fear, but because she was realizing what she had done. Jack knew that feeling, knew it too well. He crouched in front of her, his voice quiet. "Maddie." She didn't look at him. She was staring at the body of the man she had shot, the first man she had ever killed. Jack reached out, gently resting his hand over hers, easing the pistol from her grip. She let go. Her fingers curled into her palms instead, like she was trying to rub the memory off them. Jack exhaled. "You did what you had to." Her breath hitched. I... Jack didn't let her spiral. "You saved me." That made her eyes snap up to his. "I was dead," Jack said flatly. "That man was going to put a bullet in my skull. You stopped him." Maddie's lip trembled. "I didn't want to..." Jack nodded. "I know." She swallowed hard. Then, so softly Jack barely heard it, "I don't want to be like them." Jack's chest tightened. "You're not." Maddie searched his face, looking for the lie. She didn't find one. Then slowly she nodded. Jack exhaled. He pulled her close, wrapping an arm around her, letting her lean into him for just a moment. She was still shaking, but she wasn't breaking. Jack could work with that. Sheriff Daniels and his deputies were still securing the scene. Some of them were searching the bodies for IDs, weapons, anything that might tell them who they had just killed. Jack wasn't holding his breath. Whoever these men were, they had powerful people backing them, people who would wipe their records clean before the sun rose. Jack walked over to Daniels, his expression unreadable. "Anything?" The sheriff shook his head. "Burner phones, no wallets, no IDs." Jack clenched his jaw. Daniels frowned. "What the hell are we dealing with, Callahan?" Jack exhaled. "Something bigger than either of us." The sheriff nodded. "Grim. Figures." Jack turned, looking at the kids. They were watching him, waiting for him to tell them what happened next. Jack straightened. "We need to disappear," he said. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "That bad?" Jack's expression was cold. "They won't stop." Daniels sighed. "Where do we take them?" Jack turned back to the highway, to the bodies, to the blood. Then he answered, "Somewhere they won't be found." The convoy moved again, leaving the wreckage behind. The only thing left were tire tracks in the dirt and the bodies of the men who had come for them. But Jack wasn't done. Not yet. Because he had finally realized something. Saving these kids wasn't enough. He had to end this. For good. And to do that, he needed to go deeper, right into the heart of the operation. Jack Callahan had spent years running from war. Now he was walking straight back into it. The road stretched long and empty ahead of them, the horizon painted in the dying embers of the sun. The convoy moved in silence, Sheriff Daniels' cruiser leading, Jack's stolen pickup in the middle, and two unmarked patrol trucks trailing behind. Jack kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near his rifle. His sharp eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, watching for threats, watching for headlights that shouldn't be there. Beside him, Maddie stared blankly ahead, her body stiff. Ben was curled against her, still silent, still lost in whatever dark place his mind had taken him. Jack exhaled slowly. The fight on the highway was over, but the war had just begun. They drove for over an hour before Daniels finally spoke through the radio. "We're coming up on the turnoff." Jack clicked the mic. "How far?" "Couple miles, left side, hidden entryway, old hunting road." Jack didn't like it. Too exposed, too vulnerable. Daniels must have sensed his hesitation. "It's secure. No one knows it's there but me." Jack still didn't like it, but he didn't have a better option. They needed time to regroup, time to plan, time to decide what the hell came next. 15 minutes later, the convoy veered off the highway, tires crunching over gravel as they slipped onto an overgrown path hidden beneath thick pines. The road twisted through dense forest, winding up into the hills. Jack kept his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't trust back roads. Too many blind spots, too many places to get boxed in. But Daniels wasn't lying. There was no sign that this road had been traveled in years. It was the kind of place only a local would know about. Jack's grip loosened slightly, just slightly. The trees thinned as they climbed higher, revealing an old wooden cabin nestled into the hillside. It was large, 2 stories, built sturdy, but worn from years of abandonment. Jack pulled up behind Daniels' cruiser, scanning the perimeter. The place was empty. No lights, no movement. Jack liked that. Daniels climbed out first, stretching his back. "Used to belong to my uncle," he said. "Hasn't been touched in years. Got a basement, a backup generator, running water when the pipes don't freeze." Jack nodded. "It'll do." He stepped out, turning to Maddie. "Come on, let's get inside." She didn't move. Her fingers were gripping the truck's door handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Jack softened his voice. "Maddie." She inhaled sharply and nodded. Then, with slow, careful movements, she climbed out, pulling Ben with her. Jack watched them closely. They were running on fumes. No sleep, no food, no safety. Jack needed to change that. Fast. Daniels' men worked quickly, checking the cabin for weak spots, setting up a basic perimeter. Jack carried Ben inside, placing him on an old couch, then turned to Maddie. "Wait here." She blinked up at him. "Where are you going?" Jack hesitated. Then he crouched in front of her. "I need to talk to Daniels. You're safe here. No one's coming." She swallowed hard. Nodding, Jack stood. Then, after a pause, he squeezed her shoulder. "You did good today," he murmured. Her lip trembled, but she didn't speak. Jack didn't push. She wasn't ready for words, but she had heard him. That was enough, for now. Outside, Daniel stood near his cruiser, arms crossed, watching the last light disappear beyond the trees. Jack walked up beside him, voice low. "How bad is this going to get?" Daniels exhaled through his nose. "Bad." Jack nodded. He already knew that. Daniels turned, facing him fully. "We need to go to the feds." Jack's expression didn't change. "No." Daniels narrowed his eyes. "You saw what we're dealing with. This isn't some backwoods operation. This is organized, international for all we know. You think we can handle this alone?" Jack's jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice," Daniels scoffed. "Bullshit. You just don't trust the system." Jack met his gaze. "Neither do you." Silence. Daniels looked away first. Then he sighed, rubbing his face. "Damn it." Jack didn't respond. They both knew the truth. If they went to the wrong people, if they handed this case off to the wrong agency, it would disappear. The bodies would disappear. The kids would disappear. And the bastards behind all of this, they'd keep going. Just with more caution, more money, more power. Jack clenched his fists. That wasn't an option. Daniels exhaled. Fine. No feds, but we need something. Jack's mind was already working. We go after their money, he muttered. Daniels frowned. What? Jack turned to him. Operations like this don't survive without cash flow. Traffickers don't run on ideology. They run on profit. Daniels' eyes darkened. You think you can cut them off? Jack nodded. I know I can. Because Jack didn't just know how to kill men, he knew how to ruin them, and he was going to gut this operation from the inside out. Daniels nodded slowly. All right, say you're right. Say we go after the money. How the hell do we find it? Jack's lips curled into a grim smile. We asked the bastard in your holding cell. Jack didn't sleep that night, neither did Daniels. They sat in the cabin's dimly lit kitchen. A map spread between them, marking locations, suspected drop points, storage facilities, bank accounts linked to fake corporations. Piece by piece, they started building a target list. The people funding this. The places hiding their people, the network behind it all. Jack's mind worked faster than it had in years, because now he had something he hadn't had before, a plan, a mission, a war, and for the first time in years, he wanted this fight. At dawn, Jack walked out onto the cabin's porch. Maddie was sitting on the steps, arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up when she heard him. Jack sat beside her. She didn't speak. Neither did he. They just watched the sunrise together. Finally, after a long silence, she whispered, "What happens now?" Jack exhaled. Then, with quiet, lethal certainty, he answered, "We burn them to the ground." The cabin was quiet in the early morning light. The only sound, the faint rustle of wind through the trees. The weight of the last 24 hours hung heavy in the air, pressing down on Jack Callahan's shoulders like the ghosts of wars past. He had spent years in the field, eliminating threats, dismantling networks, and hunting men who thought they were untouchable. But this was different, because this wasn't about orders. This wasn't about a mission briefing handed down from some intelligence office. This was personal. And Jack wasn't just going to stop these people, he was going to erase them. Sheriff Daniels emerged from the back room, rubbing his tired eyes. He had been interrogating the prisoner for hours, trying to get something useful. Jack didn't wait for him to speak. What did he say? Daniels exhaled. Not much. He's trained. Jack's jaw clenched. I can break him. Daniels eyed him warily. I'm sure you can, but we do things a little different around here, Callahan. Jack's voice was cold. Your way is too slow. Daniels shook his head. And yours gets people disappeared. Jack held his gaze. Then he smirked. Daniels sighed. Look, he gave us something. I don't know if it's enough. Jack leaned in. Then let's make sure it is. The prisoner sat in the basement of the cabin, his wrists zip-tied to an old wooden chair. Blood dried at the corner of his mouth from where Jack had broken his nose the night before. Jack stared down at him. The man smirked, even with a split lip. You're running out of time. Jack crouched, bringing his face level. You think so? The man's smirk didn't waver. You have no idea how deep this goes. You think you're playing the hero? You think you won? Jack didn't answer. The man chuckled, voice hoarse. You saved, what, 10 kids? There are thousands more. They'll keep moving them. They'll adjust. But you've made yourself a problem. Jack studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he grabbed the man's left wrist and snapped his pinky finger. The scream that tore from the man's throat was raw, jagged. Jack let him feel it. Let him understand. Then he spoke, his voice low, calm. I am not the police. Jack murmured. I don't need confessions. I don't need warrants. I don't need paperwork. He tightened his grip. All I need is a name. The prisoner panted through the pain. You're dead, Callahan. You just don't know it yet. Jack smiled. Then he reached into his belt, pulled out his knife, and drove the tip into the man's thigh. The prisoner choked on his scream. Daniels flinched from where he stood in the corner, but he didn't stop him. Jack twisted the blade slightly. You think you're dealing with amateurs, he said, his voice a deadly whisper. You think I'm just another grunt with a gun. The man's breath hitched. Jack leaned in. "I used to train people like you," he murmured. The man's face was pale now, sweat beading at his forehead. Jack pulled the blade free. "You have one more chance," he said. The man swallowed hard. His fingers twitched. Then, finally, he broke. The name he gave them wasn't just a name. It was the name. A fixer, a man who made problems disappear. The kind of man Jack had hunted before. His name was Victor Lorne, and he was the one pulling the strings. Daniel swore under his breath. Jesus Christ, that Victor Lorne? Jack's eyes sharpened. "You know him?" Daniels nodded grimly. "He's been on every watch list for the past decade, but no one can touch him. He's got politicians, federal agents, entire police departments in his pocket." Jack's fingers flexed around his knife. Not anymore. Jack left the prisoner bleeding in the chair. Daniel's deputies would take care of him. Jack had a bigger target now. He was going after Lorne, and he wasn't coming back until the bastard was dead. The problem was getting to him. Lorne was untouchable, protected by layers of security, hidden behind powerful men who owed him favors. Jack couldn't go in through the front door. He needed to make Lorne come to him, and he knew exactly how to do it. By nightfall, Jack was on the move again. Maddie and Ben were left in Daniel's care, hidden deep in the woods. The other kids had been taken to safe houses, their names wiped from every system. Jack didn't say goodbye, because he wasn't done yet, not until this ended. He made the first call to an old contact in D.C., a woman named Celia Kane. She answered on the second ring. "You're alive," she said. Jack smirked. "For now." Celia exhaled. "I saw the news. That shootout on the highway. That was you." Jack didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. Celia sighed. "What do you need, Callahan?" Jack leaned against the hood of a stolen car, watching the stars. "Victor Lorne." Silence. Then her voice was sharp. "You cannot be serious." Jack just waited. Celia swore under her breath. "You don't go after men like Lorne. You let them rot from the inside. That's the only way to take them down." Jack's voice was steel. "I don't have time for that." Celia hesitated. Then reluctantly she said, "He's hosting a gala tomorrow night. Black tie. Lots of rich, powerful scumbags. If you want him, that's your best shot." Jack smirked. "Perfect," Celia groaned. "I hate that tone." Jack didn't answer, because the plan was already forming in his head. He was going to walk into Lorne's world, into his house, and he was going to burn it down from the inside. Jack Callahan had spent years trying to live a quiet life, trying to let go of the things he had done, trying to forget what it felt like to hunt men in the dark. But now he remembered, and by this time tomorrow, Victor Lorne would be dead. Jack Callahan hadn't worn a suit in years. It felt unnatural, like a second skin that didn't fit quite right. The stiff collar, the weight of the tailored jacket, it all felt wrong. But tonight, he needed to blend in, because tonight he was walking straight into the lion's den. Victor Lorne was a ghost. His name didn't show up on any official records, but his influence was woven through the highest levels of power: politics, finance, international arms deals, and now, human trafficking. Jack had spent years taking out men like Lorne, but Lorne was different. Lorne wasn't just part of the machine. Lorne was the machine. Jack wasn't just taking out a target. He was taking down an entire system, and there was no room for error. The gala was being held at an exclusive private estate in upstate New York. High-profile guests, millionaires, foreign dignitaries, the kind of people who made problems disappear with a phone call. Jack wasn't on the guest list, but Celia had taken care of that. His invitation had belonged to a man named Daniel Crane, a Swiss banker with a fondness for laundering cartel money. Jack had intercepted him in a parking garage 2 hours ago. Crane wouldn't be making it to the party. Jack, on the other hand, he had a reservation. The black sedan pulled up to the gated entrance, rolling to a smooth stop in front of the uniformed guards. A long line of luxury vehicles stretched behind him, engines humming, headlights casting long shadows over the marble driveway. Jack adjusted his cufflinks, then rolled down the window. The guard leaned in. "Invitation." Jack handed it over. The man studied it, then glanced at him. Jack held his gaze, his face unreadable. Then the guard nodded. "You're clear, Mr. Crane." The iron gates groaned open. Jack exhaled slowly as the car rolled forward. He was inside. Now the real work began. The estate was enormous, a sprawling mansion with towering columns, wide balconies, and sprawling gardens lit with golden lanterns. Waiters in black vests weaved through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. Everything about the place screamed power. Jack moved through the party with purpose, scanning the room, mapping exits, cataloguing security positions. He spotted Lorne almost immediately. The man was standing near the grand staircase, drink in hand, surrounded by men who had never worked a real day in their lives. His suit was crisp, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. Lorne looked comfortable, like a man who had never had to be afraid. Jack was going to change that. He moved toward the bar, his posture relaxed, slipping into the rhythm of the room. He needed to get close to Lorne, but he couldn't rush it. He ordered a whiskey, sipped it slowly, waited, and then a voice. "You don't look like a banker." Jack turned. The woman standing beside him was young, mid-30s, striking, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She held a champagne flute between two fingers, her gaze sharp. Jack smiled faintly. "And you don't look like a guest," she smirked. "Observant." Jack sipped his drink. "And you are?" She studied him. "Natalia Orlov. I handle logistics for Mr. Lorne." Jack's pulse slowed. He kept his expression unreadable. "Logistics," he murmured. "That's a broad term." She tilted her head. "And what do you do, Mr. Crane?" Jack exhaled, his smile never slipping. "I help people move their money, no questions asked." Natalia hummed. "Then maybe we should talk." Jack let his gaze flicker to Lorne. "That depends," he said. "Can you introduce me to your boss?" Natalia smiled. "Follow me." Lorne didn't acknowledge him at first. Jack stood patiently as Natalia murmured something in his ear. Then slowly Lorne turned. His gaze was piercing, calculating. Jack felt the weight of it. Then Lorne smiled. "Daniel Crane," he said smoothly. "I've heard a lot about you." Jack smiled back. "All good things, I hope." Lorne chuckled. "Of course." Jack extended his hand. Lorne shook it. Jack felt the shift immediately. This was a man used to reading people, assessing them. Jack let him look, let him see exactly what he wanted him to see. A man who didn't ask questions. A man who could be useful. Lorne nodded slightly, satisfied. "Let's talk business." The conversation was smooth. Lorne didn't waste time with pleasantries. He got straight to the point. His operation was expanding. More clients, more product, more efficiency. Jack played his part well. He asked the right questions, nodded at the right moments, and then Lorne leaned forward, voice dropping just slightly. "There's something happening soon," he murmured. "A new shipment, a special one." Jack's fingers curled slightly around his glass. "How special?" Lorne smiled. "You'll see." Jack forced a smirk. "I like surprises." Lorne studied him again. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small black keycard. "Meet me at the docks tomorrow night," he said. "If you're really interested in working with us, you'll want to be there." Jack took the keycard. He turned it over in his hand, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it. This was the door. And Jack Callahan was about to kick it wide open. The night stretched on, but Jack didn't stay long after that. He had what he needed. He had the when. Now he just needed the how. Jack slipped out of the party unnoticed, blending into the night. By the time he reached his stolen car, he had already made his decision. He grabbed his phone and dialed. Celia picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you're alive," she muttered. Jack smirked. "For now." Celia exhaled. "What do you need?" Jack turned the keycard over in his hand. "I need weapons," he said. "I need transport, and I need an exit strategy." Celia swore under her breath. "You're going after them, aren't you?" Jack's voice was quiet. "Yeah." A long silence. Then, "Where do you need me?" Jack's lips curled into a grim smile. Lorne's docks, tomorrow night. Celia hesitated. Jack, if you do this, there's no going back. Jack stared out at the city skyline, his grip tightening around the wheel. I was never going back anyway. And with that, he hung up. Tomorrow night. Jack wasn't just going to watch the operation, he was going to end it. And when he was done, Lorne's empire would burn. The warehouse docks stretched into the cold night. Rows of shipping containers stacked like tombstones under the glow of floodlights. Jack Callahan stood in the shadows, his stolen keycard clenched between his fingers. This was it, the heart of Victor Lorne's operation. And by the time the sun rose, it would be gone. Jack had spent the last 24 hours preparing for this moment, gathering weapons, mapping escape routes, studying blueprints. Celia had done her part, securing a stolen van with falsified transport papers. She had also delivered a tactical vest, a silenced pistol, an M4 carbine, and enough ammunition to wage a small war. Jack had taken all of it, because tonight he wasn't playing soldier. He was finishing this. The docks were crawling with guards. Jack counted at least 20. Too many for a direct assault. He needed precision. He needed surgical destruction. Jack exhaled slowly. Then he moved. The first guard never saw him coming. Jack slipped through the stacks of containers, moving low, staying in the blind spots. A single, silent takedown, knife across the throat, body lowered carefully. Then another and another. By the time Jack reached the main loading bay, 5 men were already dead. No alarms, no gunshots, just erasure. Jack crouched behind a forklift, watching. The shipment was being prepped, and it wasn't drugs, it wasn't weapons. It was kids, dozens of them, locked in metal cages, their faces pale and hollow. Jack's jaw tightened. This was it, the core of Lorne's operation. And tonight, it ended. Jack moved fast. He slid into the back of a transport truck, pressing against the metal siding as guards moved around outside. He planted explosives along the undercarriage, small, precise charges designed to cripple the entire shipment without harming the captives inside. Then he moved to the containers. Each was marked with coded serial numbers, destinations carefully scrubbed from government systems. Jack didn't need to decode them. He just needed to make sure they never left. He placed the last charge beneath the largest container, then retreated to a safe position. The detonator was warm in his palm. Jack exhaled, then he clicked the trigger. The explosion ripped through the docks. Shockwaves blasted through the air, fire bursting from the transport truck. Metal twisted and groaned, guards screamed, and chaos erupted. Jack moved before the smoke even cleared. Gun raised, a single silent execution. 2, 3, 4 men down before the rest even realized what was happening. Then the alarms blared. Jack didn't care. This wasn't about stealth anymore. This was war. Victor Lorne was running. Jack saw him through the flames, his polished shoes pounding against the asphalt as he sprinted toward a black SUV. Jack raised his rifle, lined up the shot. Then a bullet clipped past his ear. Jack jerked back, ducking behind a crate as return fire ripped through the air. Lorne had backup. Jack growled. They weren't stopping him. Not now. Jack pushed forward. He weaved between containers, bullets whizzing past his head. His M4 kicked against his shoulder, dropping men one by one. He reached the last truck just as it roared to life. Lorne was inside, escaping. Jack sprinted. Gunfire followed him, but he didn't stop, didn't slow. He jumped. One hand gripped the truck's rear bumper. The other swung up, catching the edge of the cargo hold. Then he hauled himself inside. The truck lurched, speeding toward the exit. Jack climbed up, forcing his body into the cab. Lorne turned, eyes widening. Jack drove his fist into his jaw. The truck swerved wildly, tires screeching. Jack grabbed the wheel, wrestling it back under control as Lorne swung at him again. Jack caught his wrist, twisted. Bone snapped. Lorne screamed. The truck veered and crashed through the dock gates. Silence. Smoke. The taste of blood. Jack groaned, forcing himself upright. Lorne lay crumpled against the dashboard, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Jack exhaled. Then he reached down, gripping Lorne's collar. He yanked him from the wreckage, dragging him into the dirt. Lorne gasped for air, coughing blood. "You," he wheezed, "you think this ends with me?" Jack crouched beside him. "You're right," he murmured. Then he pressed his pistol to Lorne's forehead and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the burning docks. Then there was nothing but the crackling of fire. Jack stood over the corpse, watching as the last breath left Lorne's body. It was done. The man who had orchestrated it all. Gone. But Jack wasn't stupid. Lorne was just a piece of something larger, and Jack Callahan had just declared war on it. By the time law enforcement arrived, Jack was already gone. So were the kids. Celia had handled the extraction, moving them to safe houses, wiping their existence from any traceable record. They were free, for now. Jack stood on a ridge, watching the flames consume the last remains of Lorne's empire. It was over. But Jack knew better than anyone. There was always another battle, and he was ready for it. Maddie and Ben sat in the back of an unmarked transport van, safe for the first time in weeks. Jack opened the door, crouching beside them. Ben looked up at him, his small hands clenched in his lap. "You're leaving," the boy whispered. Jack exhaled. "Yeah." Maddie's throat worked, but she didn't speak. Jack reached out, squeezing her shoulder. "You're safe now." She swallowed hard. "What about the others?" Jack's jaw tightened. He already knew what he had to do. "I'll find them." Maddie studied him. "You promise?" Jack met her gaze. "Yeah." Her lip trembled. Then she nodded. Jack squeezed Ben's shoulder, then stepped back. The van doors closed, and Jack turned away. Celia leaned against a stolen sedan, arms crossed. "You could stop," she said. Jack adjusted the strap of his rifle. "You know I won't." Celia exhaled. "Yeah, I know." Jack climbed into the driver's seat. He had a new mission now, one that didn't end with Lorne, one that wouldn't ever end. He was going to hunt down every last piece of this operation, and he wasn't stopping until the people responsible were buried, because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war, and Jack Callahan never lost a war.